Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am very pleased to introduce this virtual event with Felton Earls and MARY CARLSON presenting their new book, Voice, Choice, and Action, The Potential of Young Citizens to Heal Democracy, in conversation with ALEX KOTLOWITZ. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. Just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase copies of Voice, Choice, and Action on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and of our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Harvard Square. We thank you so much for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and of the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings recently, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. Felton Earls is Professor Emeritus of Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School and Professor Emeritus of Human Behavior and Development at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. MARY CARLSON is Associate Professor of Psychiatry, Neuroscience, retired at Harvard Medical School, and a Research Associate Emerita of the Department of Psychiatry at Boston Children's Hospital. ALEX KOTLOWITZ, a former staff writer at the Wall Street Journal, is the author of 4 books, including his most recent, An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago, and the national bestseller, There Are No Children Here, which the New York Public Library selected as one of the 150 most important books of the 20th century. Tonight, they'll be discussing Tony and Maya's new co-authored book, Voice, Choice, and Action, The Potential of Young Citizens to Heal Democracy. Voice, Choice, and Action is the fruit of the extraordinary personal and professional partnership of a psychiatrist and a neurobiologist whose research and social activism have informed each other for the last 30 years. Voice, Choice, and Action vividly presents the science, ethics, and everyday practice of fostering young citizens eager to confront diverse health and social challenges. Dr. Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot, Emily Hargroves Fisher Research Professor of Education at Harvard Graduate School of Education and overall academic goddess, praises Voice, Choice, and Action is at once a richly detailed narrative, a discerning analysis, a moral declaration, a rigorous roadmap, and an urgent call to action. I'm so honored to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Tony, Maya, and Alex.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nell, thanks so much. Well, God, it's exciting to be here with my old friends, Tony and Maya, and so much to talk about. I want to talk about the book. I also, at some point, I hope we have the chance to talk about just how one collaborates with a spouse in writing a book, something I don't know that I am capable of. So I guess this is just a really remarkable book. You know, it's really kind of a biography of an idea, this notion that we need to work at making children fuller and more respected citizens. And the book in many ways couldn't be more timely. I mean, with our president kicking at the very legs of our democracy, we should welcome any conversation about how we might fortify our democracy. And this book speaks so much to that. I mean, I just think about the title of the book, the subtitle, The Potential of Young Citizens to Heal Democracy. And I want to read a line from early on in the book, which I think speaks to the theme of what we're about to talk about tonight. And you write, democratic societies cannot be sustained unless children are recognized beginning at birth as valuable members, as citizens of their communities. And I think that speaks to the essence of what you've tried to get at in this book. And I want to begin, if we could, actually, Tony, with you reading a short section that talks a little bit about, I think, if I'm reading right, was kind of a turning point for you early on in your career.
It was. It was April the 4th, 1968, the date that Martin Luther King was assassinated, that I decided that I couldn't continue in being a laboratory scientist, that my career had been carefully orchestrated up to that point to be a neurobiologist with a possible career in neurosurgery. But I spent more time in the laboratory than I did in the surgical suite. But on April the 4th, April the 5th, the day after, realizing that I couldn't continue being separated from the world by a laboratory or a surgical suite, I had to make up my mind to change my career. And so I went to New York and did something totally different. And let me read for you a few paragraphs from that episode in my own personal life. The hospital's neighborhood, East Harlem, was a hotspot for all forms of urban ills, from drug use and domestic violence to underemployment and deteriorating housing. My first patient was an infant born addicted to heroin, who died in agonizing withdrawal 2 days after her birth. I did not sleep at all during the 48 hours of her life. My second patient was a 15-year-old boy who arrived in the emergency room having been stabbed. I stabilized him and he was quickly transferred to surgery. Normally, that would have been the end of our contact. But he remembered my name, and a few days later, before being discharged, he asked to see me. That was odd. Will you be working in the emergency room tonight, he asked. Because I'm going to send the motherfucker who did this to me in here, and I want you to treat him. I want you to treat him like you treated me. It took me a moment to understand where he was going with this, but I translated this as a call for equal impact. He stabbed me, and it's my duty to get him back. But he didn't kill me, so I don't want him to die either. He added, looking at me in the face, if you're as good a doctor as I think you are, you will know what to do. But exactly what was I supposed to do? My chief resident advised calling the police, but I chose a different tack. I went home with the boy, met his parents, and tried to diffuse his need for revenge. I don't know what happened. I never saw him again. I felt, however, that I'd done the right thing. I had entered his social orbit, the neighborhood whose dynamics he knew all too well. Our brief conversation had made it clear that his parents' perspective did not square very well with his own. But as a danger was erupting in his life, they had an opportunity to listen to his account. This event and others like it awakened a new realization. Hospitals were endpoints for a spectrum of health issues. By breaking ranks and leaving the hospital with an angry adolescent, I'd entered another zone. It was a dangerous zone, but I liked the idea of moving upstream from the ultimate impacts of drugs and violence. My interest turned from the endpoint to the origins, and the hope that community programs could protect children from succumbing to inequities and urban blight. The calculus was simple. Either I could labor, probably in vain, to save one newborn junkie, or with the same amount of effort, I might be able to prevent hundreds of children from being exposed to community violence and its consequences. And so I embarked on a career in child psychiatry and public health.
So, Tony, it feels like that experience really shaped you and sort of thinking about how, as you say, you can get in on the front end. And I suspect in some ways kind of is the arc that ultimately led you and Maya to write this book. And one of the things you talk about in this book, and this is when you and I met when you were here in Chicago doing this incredible longitudinal study in the city about what makes a community work. And you guys sort of popularized this notion of what's called collective efficacy, this notion that communities have this capacity to work together almost as a single organism. But can you talk a little bit about sort of what you took out of that experience about the children you met during those 12 years?
Yeah, I think that the children in well-functioning neighborhoods that had high levels of collective efficacy, were being supervised. That they had baseball teams and softball teams and athletic activities that adults supervised. And that made a huge difference in the safety and the confidence that these children had about growing up. In communities that had low collective efficacy, there weren't a lot of men involved in volunteering to supervise children that were not their own children, particularly. There weren't baseball teams and there weren't supervised activities in parks. In fact, many parks were gang turfs that one had to negotiate very carefully because of the danger that exists. So we had found something important. We discovered something important in measuring collective efficacy, but we had no idea how you create it, how you sustain it, and how you make it work for children. So my research continued beyond that point by doing studies that asked children to analyze the neighborhoods that they lived in uniquely by themselves, to get a true adolescent orientation to what that neighborhood felt like and how it ran in the lives of children as told to us by children themselves. And that was a breakthrough because these children had a lot to talk about. That nobody had probed these issues with them in a sincere and profound and prolonged way. And so we changed our minds. We grew up and realized that children had capacities that were being untapped. And we needed to learn how to tap into the wisdom and the insight and the courage that many children had.
And in fact, one of the things that you took away from that, and you write about this in the book, is that you were in some ways surprised that many of those adolescents, this is a city at that time when you were here, was racked by community violence, by street violence, and the kids talked about some of the measures that have been taken, presumably to protect them, to make them feel safer. And they talked about in some ways how those moves in some ways were both humiliating and actually left them feeling even more vulnerable.
That's right.
And I think, as you point out too, I think the other thing about this project on human development, this longitudinal study, is this notion of how important nurturing is. And this makes me think, Maya, of your time in Romania. Can you talk a little bit? You were there at this extraordinary moment, and where you saw so many Romanian children being raised in orphanages, and maybe you could give a little backdrop as to how it is that so many children in Romania ended up getting raised in orphanages, because this is very much a kind of political decision.
I can talk about the policies of Nicolae Ceausescu, who set up this idea, excuse me, that the state owned the fetuses, that anyone who was pregnant, that the state could decide what happened. And he started a pronatalist policy where he did everything he could to make sure that there were more and more children born every year, because he was in competition. Though he was a part of the Soviet bloc, he was in competition with Russia and was trying to become more productive and trying to make his country stand out in industrialization. So what he did was, first of all, he got rid of birth control and abortion, And then he actually started setting up policies to where women had to be checked every month at work to make sure if they were pregnant or not. And if they were pregnant, then they'd be watched by the secret police to make sure that they wouldn't do anything to interrupt that pregnancy. And they were required to have children, to have at least 5, I believe, until they had done their part for the state. So what it meant that particularly poor people were having more and more children than they could that they could survive, that they could support. So they built these institutions, these state institutions called legans, which is Romanian for cradle. And what would happen is a woman would deliver a baby and then they would just leave the baby there because they knew they couldn't take care of it, or if they did take care of it, they'd have to turn in one of their other children so that they could support the number of mouths they had. So what happened was that this kind of grew and grew, and they did increase the population, but it happened in such a way at the same time that Romania was going through all kinds of economic issues that the poverty became extraordinary, and the country was left with hundreds of thousands of infants being raised in these so-called cradles, where there was no training for how to care for children. They were bottle fed, they were swaddled, they were left in their cribs. And because of antibiotics and because they had medical personnel who could treat certain kinds of diseases, the kind of failure to thrive diseases that children like that get, they were able to keep these infants alive. And nobody seemed to know about it. At least it didn't get outside of the country until there was a revolution, and Ceausescu and his wife were both assassinated on Christmas Day. And when that happened, people started coming in, like the World Health Organization and all, to see what was going on in this country, and it was discovered. But this was something that upset the world. I mean, it was on TV, it was talked about all the time. When you say something about you work in Romania, people would say, oh, tell me, oh, it's awful, I can't believe it. But the thing was that I wasn't like being an ambulance chaser, like, oh my, there's something terrible happening to children, let me go there. That I'd actually started out my freshman year in college taking psychology. And I thought studying psychology, you learned about what people thought and did. But it turned out I didn't realize I had the most famous professor at the University of Wisconsin, Harry Harlow. And after the first week, when he started doing things like acting like a monkey and talking about making descriptions of monkey sounds and raising monkeys, about raising monkeys and what happens when you raise them without their mothers, I didn't realize that I was sort of at that point in 1961 on the leading edge of that research, which became famous and in some way infamous. But those studies showed very clearly things that people had known from other institutions, like orphanages or institutions for the blind, that children who in the first years of life are not touched, it's particularly touch, because that's swaddling and cuddling and touching is a very important early sensory experience, that if they're lacking in touch for the first, particularly after the first 2 years of age, but even before that, that all kinds of social stages of development are retarded, not retarded, but never materialize. Like smiling, they may smile in the first weeks, but if somebody doesn't smile back, the smiling goes away. Or they may vocalize, but if somebody isn't reciprocating, that goes away. And so what was known from monkeys and was known from earlier studies and institutions became this incredible finding of this country that had been keeping cover over what they had been doing to hundreds of thousands of children for many years. And so because I had done that research, and worked in Harlow's lab as an undergraduate and knew about what monkeys look like, I also went and worked in chimpanzee laboratories for my master's degree and saw the same kind of thing about maternal deprivation with chimpanzees, but never thinking that one would ever come across something like that that would happen unknown to the rest of the world and to that number of children. And so I'd been studying sensory pathways and touch and things like that, looking at parts of the brain that has to do with early touch, and hadn't been studying things like institutions. But we found out a colleague had set up an experiment in one of these institutions trying to use enriched rearing experiences. So these same children that would be in a room of 20 with only one untrained caretaker, that they were certain ones that they were randomly selected an equal number of children to go into a new setting that he designed. There was just 4 children to a room with a trained caretaker and a lot of the things that are associated with good childcare. And his experiments were showing that if in these institutions and if in these first 6 to 12 months of life, children got this enrichment, that it appeared that you might be able to at least prevent any more retardation of social skills and social development. And so, you know, this wasn't to say that let's keep the orphanages going, let's just enrich them. But it was anyway a way of saying that there's something here that we need to understand because it has implications for a lot of children.
So let me ask both of you this. I mean, so in some ways you guys are sort of looking at these both ends of childhood. You know, Maya, you in Romania at the very young, and Tony, you at adolescence. And what you kind of came up with, which feels somewhat intuitive, I mean, but you brought the science to it, is this notion that if kids are nurtured, they're going to be fuller, richer human beings for it. Let me ask where this intersects with the sort of underlying notion of this book. It's a term that you guys use, a deliberative citizenship. And I think you use that term purposely because you don't want to suggest in this book that you want to lower the voting age and get kids to vote. That's not what this book is about. And so can you talk a little bit about this notion of deliberative citizenship and where it intersects with what you discovered both in Chicago and Romania?
Sure. It was important to avoid the voting, the electoral representation, representative government, and think of children as part of their neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And that in informal settings in their neighborhoods, they can be active and involved in a series of activities that improve the life of their neighbors. So citizenship is local, and it's bringing children in a way in which they can be respected and productive. And
so, Tony, practically, how does that look? How does that look in a place like Chicago?
Well,
or how could it look, I guess?
It worked. It taught us a lot. Mm-hmm. That what happens is that children join in with adults. That's very important. They're not working by themselves. They're working in groups of adults where the adults say that there's a level playing field, that your ideas are worth as much as mine are, despite the age difference. And if they're respected, they can be rational and intensive and exploratory in coming up with their ideas. And we call this deliberative because it is a rational process. It's not that they are torn by their emotions and drawn into peer negative activities. If the space is right and the adult supervision is right, that they can be quite productive and imaginative and come up with things that adults wouldn't necessarily think of themselves or know about.
And can you give an example from your time in Chicago where that?
Sure.
Yeah.
One of the things that we were doing is developing ways of measuring exposure to violence. Mm-hmm. And we thought of violence as people shooting and using knives and fighting. And our initial instrument that we developed focused on those kinds of activities. When the young people who were interns in our project, 14, 15-year-olds, looked at the instrument, they said, it's unbelievable that you call this exposure to violence without including things that we experience every day. One example they gave that resonated throughout the city, actually, was the metal detectors that they had to go through to go to class. They considered that an invasion of their privacy. They gave an example of a girl who had the handheld device go off when she walked through the door. And it turned out that it was a metal in a brass strap she had, but they made her undress in order to prove that. And that assault on one's dignity, they said, was exposure to violence that was as consequential as we're seeing and learning about shootings in the neighborhood.
Huh. Yeah, I think very much of this moment in time, it resonates because given we've had, as you probably know, a really terrifically hard few months in Chicago in terms of the violence. And one of the things that's come out of this, especially come out in the wake of George Floyd's murder, is a cry from high school students to remove police officers from their schools who they feel are threatening and have changed the dynamics within a place that for them ordinarily feels safe. So, and Maya, how does it matter on the young end that you nurture, that it's important that we nurture kids when they're young, if we're in terms of talking about this notion of deliberative citizenship?
I mean, one of the things that happens with this early deprivation is that that language is one of the big deficits that these children have, and it's because that language is the one that was most clear because we're the speaking primate, right? I mean, language is what distinguishes us from our other primate relatives, and so language comes about very early, and people may not recognize it. I mean, particular people in institutions who aren't trained, when they hear children babbling or even crying and not responding, that if children start to vocalize and that there isn't a social response or social reciprocity, as we like to call it, that the effort to communicate or even to make sounds is lost very quickly. And there's a lot of laboratory work on things about reciprocity in terms of smiling. The more an infant smiles and someone smiles back, the more apt they are to do that. The more they vocalize, the more apt they are to vocalize back. And that these kinds of social things are reciprocal. And if you decide that a child is not able to be political or not able to have a voice that's valuable in terms of the community or in their family or their school, or that they talk and give reasons for things, but you don't think they're rational, that there's not going to be reciprocation. There's not going to be the kind of reciprocation like, oh, why did you ask that question? Ask me another question. Oh, that's interesting. So you've been wondering about that. If you don't get this kind of feedback in different stages of development, that these things become less frequent. And if the deprivation happens early enough, they actually disappear to the point that a large, an excessive amount of stimulation or a lot of stimulation later in life will not bring it back. So we started thinking about the fact that, we went to Brazil, as we were talking about, and in Brazil it was late deprivation, that the millions of children, street children that were seen in Brazil were children who were mainly from poor families who had migrated down from the Northeast, landless peasants, to industrial areas and were living in favelas, terrible slums, and there were no housing, there were no schools initially. And so these children sort of moved to the streets to survive. But those children didn't start working on the streets or move to the streets until they were older. And what happens is when you're with these children, it's so different from children in Romania who had early deprivation, that they can be living where they're sniffing glue, they're being sexually exploited, they're being shot at by police, you know, they're being hit by cars so that they don't even know if they're going to live to be 10 years old, 15 years old, or whatever. I mean, it's much worse. Well, you've been there, you said. I mean, if to see that was, particularly back in the time that we were there, and it was at its worst, is about as bad as you can imagine children surviving on their own. And yet these children were social. They shared with each other, they laughed, they smiled. So in spite of the things that had happened, that they could create situations where they could show that these social skills that they did develop earlier in life were not lost. And these are the children who, in the 80s, I think 1985, the street children started to form groups, and UNICEF helped a lot with this. But the children were doing it themselves, of organizing groups to where they would get together and discuss, you know, we are humans, we are people too, you can't treat us like this. And they'd get out, but they wouldn't just protest, but they would really have deliberations and discussions. And they would do this in a way and do it across the large enough areas of Brazil that it was brought to the attention of politicians, and they actually converged in huge numbers in Brasilia to present their case to the national government. And in doing that and having adults and different organizations that supported them, and UNICEF also acting as a contact for many of their efforts to associate, you know, to get through to government officials, they set up, they led the government to setting up a statute that started the first example of the idea of having rights for children. And that actually went on to become the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1990. It grew out of what happened in Brazil. So it's not that, and so when we think of Chicago, we think that there are no children here, or we think of the people that, the research assistants in the Chicago study that Tony led, the kinds of things they were describing were consistent with this, that these children did have, I mean, they were behind in school and reading and things like that, but they did have basic, you know, that social skills were there.
Right.
And so the idea is that you can have late deprivation where you're ignored. And this is to then compromise those skills that you developed earlier in life. So the idea is you need to have consistent social support and reciprocity. And this led from what Brazil did and what UNICEF was doing and the Convention on the Rights of the Child to us saying it's not enough just to say that children have rights. They should be citizens. And because they can talk and reason and make decisions and take action, they should be deliberative citizens, because deliberation is really the speaking and preparation for action.
I wonder why, given, I mean, I'm glad you brought up because one of the things you've done really nicely in this book is this kind of arc where you sort of lay out all the problems and in the end offer us these moments that give us some reason for hope. And I want to sort of talk a little bit about Tanzania in a moment where the book kind of ends. But I wonder what was ripe in Brazil that led to this, as you say, this kind of soft revolution with kids that we don't see here in our country.
Well, this came after there being a military junta, and which had lasted, I forget the numbers of years now, but 10 or 12 years. And the military had taken over, and that's when they were really repressive. And this film we told you about, Peixote, this wonderful film on street children, by Babenco, that this film shows these institutions that were created for street children. So as the children, as the poverty, the industry grew under the military junta, and then various things happened. I think one of the things was the petroleum, the oil embargoes and things that came about, and international financial things like that brought Brazil down really quickly. And as this happened, the military government decided to, peacefully, to give the government over to civilian control. And the stage that you start hearing about street children and hear about them not just being shot or being put in these awful institutions, that you start hearing about them forming groups and communities and getting politicians to work with them and talking about statutes and rights. This was after having been under this military rule, this very repressive military rule. So
but I hope what you're saying though isn't that that's what we need here in order to, yeah. I mean,
I wasn't saying that, but,
I guess
we have to be ready for whatever, you know.
I mean, I guess I wonder what we do practically to sort of fully engage the youth in this country, so that they're fully engaged with the country in return. And maybe we're seeing parts of that, you know, in this kind of racial reckoning at the moment, where so many of the protesters and those who are speaking out are young people, maybe not quite as young as those who you write about, but
I think that the quality of deliberation is distinctly different from protest. And that what we are encouraging young people to do and adults to support them in the effort is to understand that the deliberation comes out of a process of being trustworthy, sincere, being able to take the perspective of others,
right,
and reaching mutual understanding and doing shared social action as a result of it. And I don't think the schools necessarily are a place to do this, but the communities have to be. And what we're hoping is that community agencies around the country and cities and states and small towns and villages will take our results and innovate new ways of involving and respecting children.
Right. And this is kind of a great way to sort of pull this conversation full circle, which is that I think we can't talk about children and especially deliberative citizenship with children without talking about the adults in their lives. And it's what your work has made so abundantly clear. And, you know, the last part of your book, the two of you spend time in Tanzania working with children who were reckoning with the AIDS crisis there. And it's I don't want to give away the sort of last part of the book, but I do think maybe it's worth concluding, Maya, if you could read from, there's a small section towards the end of the book that you and I had talked about, where you run into a grandmother in a village in Tanzania, and maybe you can tell the story and then read from the book.
To quickly make that jump from Brazil to Tanzania, that after the things we learned both in Chicago, where we had a number of groups that were deliberative groups that did things around violence, you know, did interviews, did surveys and all. Then we decided we wanted to do a randomized controlled trial. I mean, now with the COVID-19 pandemic, you can say randomized controlled trial and everybody knows what that means. Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. But based on the research that Tony and his colleagues did in Chicago, there were all the kind of measurements you needed to measure both at the community level and at the individual level to see what children's capacities were, particularly around issues of efficacy, which is the confidence and the competence they feel in specific areas. And we decided that in Tanzania, what we could do with those methods is do a randomized controlled trial. We have a scripted curriculum that include all of these features that the many people who've done philosophical work, theoretical work, and research experimental work on deliberation, that we could learn from all of this and incorporate it into curriculum, and we could evaluate it at the end, where we have a control groups and experimental groups, like you hear all the time from Tony Fauci, because this is the gold standard of empirical research. So we that's the latter part of the book. But just to jump to the end, that voice, choice, and loyalty, voice, choice, and action, that the voice part was the first part to clarify. Then choice came down in many ways of what did children want to work on, what did they think was important. When we got to Tanzania, it was the height of the HIV pandemic. And people were talking about Tanzanian children in sub-Saharan Africa. They're going to be orphans. We have to build more orphanages, or end up in street shelters, or we'll have to build more shelters. And so there was this effort to, how are we going to take care of all these children that are orphaned? And UNICEF and other thinking people said, let's not give up on them. Let's help them. Let's help them to know what's happening to them and see if they can't make a difference. And so what we did was we developed this curriculum that was all about how to develop deliberation. And it was very participatory, and it was, we had children working in community groups. And one of the things that they chose to do after they learned about deliberation and making choices and taking action was to take on HIV as their topic. Malaria could have been, because it's a big disease too, but they took on HIV, and they went through a process of saying stigma is the thing we really have to deal with, because that's what's preventing us from, being able to defend against this disease. And then they took upon themselves to choose that universal testing, where you go into the community and you do confidential testing, but you use antibody tests to find out, the people volunteer, but to find out who is infected. And you do that from babies in the community to whatever age, because with HIV, the antibodies stay because the infection stays. There's no treatment. So here we are having the children educating by doing skits in the community about the virus and about the immune system and about antibodies. And they taught a medical school level course by doing skits in the community. So their community became very aware of why testing was important leading up to treatment. And so we had all these testing fairs. We had people that came in and supported these fairs, and the children actually organized them and ran them with the health facilities. And it was incredible that people said, no one's going to come out, people are too embarrassed. And instead, people came out in huge lines. And from beginning the day to the end on a weekend, 2 days, there'd be long lines left in these communities that people were still waiting to be tested. So the demand far exceeded the supply for a long time. But it showed that children could educate, they could inspire the community, and that they would come out and be tested. And if they were positive, they would seek treatment. So this was one of the last tests after months, or many, many months of doing these HIV testing fairs. And what it goes back to, I haven't forgotten your question, Alex, which is you can't talk about children without talking about adults. And the whole idea with child rights was not child liberation, but for children to be engaged in the community, engaged with adults. So they never wanted to be separate. They wanted to build their confidence and their competence so the community would want to participate with them. So it's the end of a day, the HIV testing fairs that were organized by the young citizens. And I was sitting on the steps after this long day as the sun was setting and talking to one of the facilitators as we were waiting for the end of the testing and for the counselors to start to clear up, when we saw a young, elderly woman in her colorful cotton kanga, the kind of colorful cloth wrappings that Tanzanian women wear. And she comes walking across this dusty field, and she comes up to us, and she realizes that I don't speak Swahili, but Naomi, the facilitator, does. And she smiles at me and nods and smiles at Naomi and asks her to translate. And so what she says when she looks at us is that my husband has been dead many years and I live alone. I have no men friends. Then looking away briefly as if embarrassed about sharing that private matter with strangers, she talked on about having seen young citizens doing their skits in the community and educating the community, and how she'd been watching this and how she learned that they were having these testing fairs. So she said, I'm sure I was not infected, but then she turns away sheepishly and said, but I gave them my blood to show my solidarity with the children and with my community. She was beaming as she wrapped her kanga again loosely over her arm and shoulder to cover up the recent venipuncture from having the blood drawn for her test. And then she smiled and nodded, and we nodded to show that we understood, knowing that saying thank you would not be the appropriate response to such a profound expression of support. Her statement, coupled with the image of venipuncture and her outstretched arm, struck us as incredibly poignant. These endorsements from elders represented the strongest kind of acceptance we could hope for from the community. What do you think?
Thanks, Maya. Thanks, Tony. Powerful stuff. And again, one of the things I really admire about your work, I mean, both of you are scientists, and yet you spend so much time on the ground engaging with people, and sort of have recognized, I know we've talked about Studs Terkel, but you've recognized the art and power of listening, and I just tip my hat to you for that. So I want to open it up. We have maybe 10 minutes left. I want to open up for some questions, but Nell, do you?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, yep, popped back in. Hi, but yeah, we have a few questions. Folks, if anything else comes to mind, again, we have about 10-ish minutes for Q&A, as Alex mentioned. So bring them in. So how about first, could you talk a bit about the scope of this book? Was your research focused on any particular region, or were you trying to focus largely on a globalized image of children and childhood?
I think that we were very much moved by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is a universal document that's been endorsed by every country in the world except the United States. And the United States continues to lie outside the boundaries of the convention. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it was a convention, and UNICEF did led us to Romania and Brazil, and in part to Tanzania. But it's very important that we consider the world of children as being globalized. Mm-hmm. And that our thinking about children is universal. And while we appreciate cultural differences, that the universal similarities between people override the cultural differences.
Mm-hmm. And we have kind of two similar questions, so I think I'll kind of combine them. So one from Krishna Lewis: do you think a similar kind, or similar to the work being done in Tanzania, of a similar kind of organizing by children can happen in the US to combat the pandemic? And also tied to the pandemic, we have a question: have you noticed any patterns in student responses or student activism regarding remote learning during COVID?
I can answer the first one. That, as we were finishing up the book, it was clear that we were entering into a new pandemic. And so right away, we're in touch with people in Tanzania, and we're saying, and these are people in public health, and, saying, we're worried about Tanzania because, it's hard to imagine them having the kind of health system that we have, and being able to avoid going to markets and riding on crowded buses and things like that. I mean, the idea that they would be able to do social distancing or have masks, it just seemed like it was going to be an incredible situation there. And so we talked to the research assistants that were still working in child rights and children's programs, and started asking about what can we do. And then we kept thinking, but what we did with HIV was that the children were out there, they were in the communities, they were talking to people, they were going around and knocking on doors. I mean, how is this going to happen? How are we going to do this virtually? I mean, there are a lot of computers in use, and they've been in use there during the pandemic to have virtual learning like here. But it's just a very, very different situation with COVID. And it turns out for some reason in Tanzania, it never got that bad, and COVID didn't. And I think it's because there's just not that much movement. I mean, HIV got spread around because truck drivers, and there was a lot of people moving around different parts of the country. But that things were shut down, not necessarily because the leadership there was making a point to shut it down, but it just got shut down because there was just all of the kind of crises in terms of health and in terms of unemployment developing and all. So we did do, I should say that once they did the work in HIV in Tanzania, they went to malaria next, and the children did a fantastic job. And it's not like we cured HIV or cured malaria, but what we showed is that they could learn how to teach diseases and the communities would accept it. And so this is something that, there's no reason to think that if it happens in Tanzania, it can't happen other places. There's nothing about it. And in terms of resources, it's one of the lower income countries. And so the resources you need are social. And one hopes that you can, engage social resources in any country. I'm sorry, I forgot the second question, so I'll let Tony answer that.
I'm actually rather shocked that I hear so little from children about the pandemic. That all these things are happening to them around school opening and closing, and
or access to a computer, right? I mean, access to high-speed internet and remote classrooms and so on.
So what we've done is to show that children can be productive and insightful and respectful in analyzing and understanding the context in which they live, be it violence, infectious disease, chronic disease. So it's remarkable that there's so little genuine involvement of children's capacity to reason about the pandemic and response to it, and what schools should be doing in families. I hear very little coming from children.
And here's a question, from Roberto Salva, what were the forms of adult-children relationship that emerged in your work with children in child participation? I guess
What's interesting is it was child initiated, but Tony and a couple of the researchers did an early survey when we got to Tanzania, to Moshi, Tanzania, is where we worked at the foot of Kilimanjaro. And it's about 150,000 population then, so it was a mid-sized municipality. So Tony went and his staff interviewed all of the ward officers. I mean, the ward counselors for the city. I think there were 15 of them, Tony, is that right? And they went around and talked about HIV and said, what are you doing about HIV? How successful are you being? And they go, well, we're really having a tough time, blah, 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 blah. And, nobody could say any way they'd made any headway. And I remember the thing that's in that survey, without even looking at the numbers, when they had one counselor say, you know what, the way I feel, and I wouldn't be surprised if others feel that way, that we've tried everything and haven't been able to make a difference. If the children can do it, let them try. And so they just sort of said, we can't do it. And so the children started to organize, and they did have, the education. They did have medical students who were working with us and research assistants to be able to learn about the virus and do the kind of community education they did. And they had been trained in ways on how to do deliberation by the steps of, showing sincerity, taking perspective, reaching mutual understanding, taking shared social action. I mean, they had these theories of, particularly Jürgen Habermas, on what deliberation and discourse ethics is. So it wasn't something that, sort of was common in adults. But the point was that the children, not us, determined how quickly they moved or what the decisions were. So sometimes they would say, we're going to go out and do this. And we go, what? But you know, you have a data safety and monitoring board when you do a randomized controlled trial. So if there's anything complaint or anything, that panel right away will, you know, shut you down if bad things are happening. So we were being very cautious. But children, it started that the way that children were doing this education and things in the community, they were so informed and so smart and so measured that the adults were thrilled. They couldn't believe it. I mean, they were, you know, parents were coming to us and saying it spreads to what they do at home. And so the adults couldn't help but be proud of them. And, you know, a lot of the adults wanted to learn to do the curriculum that the children had done, to learn these things themselves. So it happened in a way that we can't take credit for, but the children knew their communities, knew their families, and they progressed in a way that wasn't show-offy or anything. They weren't saying, ha ha ha, look what I know, but they were saying it's important we all know this because it can make a difference for those who are already infected and those who are not, and please listen to us. So you'd have adults who stood up when they were out doing their skits and say, I've never told this to any of you, but I'm HIV positive and I've been under treatment for years, and you should listen to these children. If somebody had spoken to me like that, I wouldn't be in the situation I am now. So it really was up to them. We feel we can't take credit for any of it. That you know, it was their real sense of judgment about how not to, you know, show off in front of other children who weren't in the groups, or to show off in terms of the adults. They were very modest, very competent, and realized they were really doing a good thing for the community.
Well, thank you. I think that's a perfect place to end it, I think. Thank you so much to all three of you, Alex and Tony and Maya. And thanks to all of you at home or wherever you're watching this, for spending your evening with us. Please learn more about this fascinating book and purchase copies of Voice, Choice, and Action at harvard.com. Again, the links are in the chat window. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Mass., have a good night. Keep reading and stay safe. Thanks. Thanks to three of you. Bye.
Thank you.